Hello, my name is Peter Raymer, and today we're going to talk about D365 Infolog messages. Now, printing out messages may be one of the earliest things that you learn how to do in any programming language, but they are really important. They're really important for developers to be able to understand what's happening in their code, but they're also very important in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations because they show information to the end user. They help the user understand what's going on. They help them understand if there's a problem that may prevent expected functionality. So I want to show you some of these details. I think this will help lay the foundation for some further articles and videos that I plan to write. But I also think that there's probably some things that you may learn where you're not using Infolog messages to their fullest. So let's get started. What are Infolog messages? They are really the messages and the messaging framework that Dynamics has to offer for sharing messages to the system. And so if we actually zoom in here a little bit, you can see here are three types of messages. We've got an info message, a warning, and an error message. But before we jump into that, what do these messages look like in other languages, just in case you're coming from another programming language and jumping into the X++ language? Well, if we look at Python, right, there's the print function. Usually there's some kind of version of printf that you may have learned in school. Here you can just pass in a string to this method. You can run it, and voila, you get out that new printed message out to the screen. So really simple and great there. W3 Schools has this great ability where you can just try the code directly on their site. If you're coming from C#, you may be familiar with console.writeLine. Very similar, right? It's going to print out that message to your console, and then you can continue working, getting information about what your program's doing. If you're writing in JavaScript, in a similar way, there's console.log. This is not going to print a message directly in your browser, but it is going to print it in your F12 tools. So if you push F12 and go over to your console on, a browser, you may see those messages print out here if you're doing console.log. So again, there's kind of a bit of a difference between printing messages just for developer purposes as well as printing for the end user's purposes. Similarly, in X++, we kind of have the same thing. We do technically have a print message in X++. You can print a message using this print keyword. It'll even convert different variable types for you to a string, and then it will print those out in Visual Studio in the output window. So here's a screenshot just to save time. Here's the sample test print job that I ran. I ran it attached to the debugger, and then I can see in this output window right here, it's printing out those messages. The downside of a print is this could only be seen in Visual Studio when I'm attached to the process. So it's really not that useful at all for the end user in a test or prod environment where we can't attach Visual Studio. And even in a development environment, the print statement is just not as helpful as, say, an info message, which is going to print to the browser. We can see it even after we've kind of stopped debugging, as well as this output window. Even though you can continue to see messages after you've stopped debugging, it just has a lot of other messages in there. So having info where we've explicitly said what messages we want to see and show to the user is extremely helpful. So again, let's back up and jump into what are the three types of messages that we can print in Dynamics. And so for that one, I'm going to go to this runnable job called Infolog messages. I've just create a runnable class /job so I can demonstrate this. We've got a global function called info. You can see it's part of the global class. I don't have to type global : : I can just type info and pass in the string that I want it to print out, which is really great. So like hello world. We've also got one called warning. Very, very similar. It'll print out a string. And then we've also got one called error. Now, the difference between these three is two things. One, in info will use this blue background as well as that icon. The warning will use the yellow background as well as this warning icon. And then an error will use this red background and this error icon. Beyond just the color, there is an implication difference with each one of these messages. When a developer writes code and they use the info, it should be just to share information to the end user. Maybe a journal posted successfully and you want them to know what that journal number was. Something like that. These are informational messages. Warnings really should be used for when there's a potential problem in the code. For instance, if we go back to the invent table and we were to search for invent table in the application parameters, and we right click on the table and say view code, it'll bring up this code. If you search for validate packing gross weight volume, here's an example of a warning in the code. There's many examples in the code, so feel free to search for your own. But here you can see that this is checking some of the settings on the item that you're saving and saying that if you've got certain things turned on and set up, but the gross volume and weight is 0, then this item is not going to be able to be boxed. Essentially saying that the expected functionality that you're probably trying to use won't work because you have not fully set up this item. Now, if we change the gross weight or the gross volume to be a non-zero number, or both of these, then we'll no longer get that warning and we can proceed. So warnings are really concerns about something, but it won't actually stop the process. And that leads us to the error message. It's important that when developers write an error message, typically these are going to be thrown. So you're going to say throw error in your code. I'll show that in a second, but essentially we want to stop the process. This, when we get an error, it usually means the process was unable to complete, or sometimes we can throw an error and catch it and continue on with, say, another sales order. Maybe we're trying to invoice hundreds of sales orders and one sales order failed to invoice. We can still continue on to other sales orders, but the error is going to indicate that that particular process, that task that we were trying to do, did not complete. And so we need to continue to go again. And so it's important that we kind of follow these best practices for how these error messages or these info messages are used, because that conveys additional meaning even more than just the message itself. So if we go back to the code here, I can see that here I threw the error, which really, when we use this keyword throw, it means stop the process, and this will go until it's caught either by the overall system or by a try catch. And so you'll notice we didn't get this last error message shown because it never made it to this line of code. All right, so those are the key info log messages, the 3 different types that you need to know, but there's still some more to it. We can actually use dynamic messages. So in dynamic messages, I'll move this around so you can see this a little bit better. I've got a runnable class. I'm just calling a method that I added here where I pass in a sales order. I can actually build out a string that's more helpful than it would be if it was just a static string message. Here I'm concatenating the words the sales order with ID and then the passed in sales order failed to be invoiced. And then I can throw that error, or I can display that info message or warning to the screen. So then what that's going to look like is this right here, where this particular value changes depending on the circumstances. And that makes it extremely helpful. If we just had an error message that said the sales order failed to be invoiced, well, maybe I don't know what sales order we're talking about. Maybe the process was looping through many orders. So it's really helpful to use some kind of identifier and give more information. If it's a status that's wrong or a weight that's wrong, being very explicit with that error message is going to be very helpful to the end user as well as a developer who's troubleshooting a particular process. So if we go back to the code here, I can see that here. Now we can take this even further and make this a little easier to write using this great function called string format, or strfmt for short. What this does is it can take a string, and then it can take as many additional parameters as you need, and for each parameter it's going to replace wherever you have %1 or %2 or %3 in this string with that parameter value. So if I were to say the sales order with ID %1 failed to be invoiced, it's going to replace %1 with sales ID. Now if I wanted to say more, I could say, you know, some other message, another message, and then I could even add that right at the end, say %2. And this is going to be replaced with whatever my next parameter is. This doesn't make sense because it's a hard-coded value, but if I was passing in a second parameter, say like an item ID or a specific sales line, I could do that as well. So it's very powerful to use string format. Additionally, if I'm passing it something that's not a string, it will automatically convert many of those data types, not all of them, but many of them, like an integer or real, to a string value for us. And so in the end, we get the exact same message printed out. But using dynamic messages is extremely powerful. All right, next, let's actually look at those different conversion methods a second. So if we look at this example of code, I've got display messages. Display messages can print out a string format message. And here you can see I've got real, integer, date, and then you know, even an additional value here. So this is an example that Microsoft provides, but essentially I just pass in my variables, my real here, my integer, and my date, and the system's going to replace these with whatever we need. So it's far easier to use string format to be able to do it. Sometimes you need to, if it's a date, to convert it yourself, so you can specify what order the year, the month, the date comes in based on maybe your region and the way you want to view it. You could use a conversion yourself using one of the many other string functions. So here int to string converts an integer variable into a string. There's int64 to string, there's real to string, there's many of these other different types, but essentially you want to use this functionality to convert those variable types into a string. But using string format does that for you, as you can see here. We don't actually need to specify it. We're taking this data type, it's converting it into the string based on our region. So very cool. Okay, now lastly, there's a conditional message that we may want to look at. So you may initially put a lot of info messages in your code as you're developing it to figure out what it's doing. Eventually, you may want to remove many of those info messages that are not super helpful once you've got the code complete and working. Otherwise, they're just too many messages. The end user doesn't need to see them. However, maybe you've got a complex process, a process that most of the time works beautifully, but occasionally does not. And when it doesn't work, the error, the trouble could occur in a bunch of different places. So it's really important that we have a lot of conditions, if statements that look for certain conditions that can then print out an info message explaining what's going wrong. But when we don't even know that, maybe we just need an info message to say how far in the process it got before it threw an error. Maybe it's calling some external DLL or something, and we need to know, is the error being thrown before or after the DLL, because we don't get to put messages in that external code. Well, in that case, it can be very helpful to condition your info messages or error messages. This way you can turn them on when there's a problem with a particular process, get more verbose error messages and info messages, and then later, once you figured out the issue, you can turn it back off. So in order to do that, you can add a parameter to whatever parameter table there is in the system. So in my case, cust parameters is the parameter for accounts receivable. So I just added a new enum called enable extra messages to the cust parameters table. After I extended it, I set the enum to no yes, which makes it a checkbox. I named it enable extra messages, and I gave it a label called enable extra messages. I made sure that my synchronize on database checkbox is true on my project. I then compiled to make sure that this field got added. Then I extended the cust parameters form, and I dragged this enable extra messages field from the data source. It's way down in here. So in this data source, I expanded fields, found that field, and then I dragged it into a new tab and group that I created in this form called enable extra messages. And so if I reload this a second, I think we can see that flag, but essentially it's a flag that I can conditionally turn on to see more verbose messages in the cases that I really need it. So this is a really helpful trick sometimes. So you can see here, if I scroll to the bottom, I've got custom parameters, and then I've got enable extra messages that I've checked on. When I do that, now when I run this runnable job, it's going to print out the message. The rec ID of the record that is currently being processed is this record, and I just made up an example, but that can be very helpful for you to see what's going on in specific cases. So here I printed out my message. Okay, so I think those are the main pieces. Info log messages are very basic. They're probably something that you've heard of and used many times before, but I'm curious to know if you've actually used them in all these different ways, with dynamic messages, using string format, with conditional flags to turn them on or off. And we'll get into some further logging capabilities or ways that you can log information for complex processes in a further video. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.